Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Hello, and welcome to the History AI podcast. I'm Chuck.
And I'm Marco. Today, we're delving into the life of one of the most influential philosophers of all time, Plato.
Plato. The man who made people think about thinking.
That's right, Chuck. He wasn't just a philosopher, he was a student of Socrates, a teacher to Aristotle, and a writer whose works are still studied today.
But before we dive into the deep end of Plato's pool of thoughts, let's have a quick word from our sponsor. From the mind behind the History AI podcast comes an electrifying journey into the past. A ripple through time, Franklin's Folly. Dive into a tale where Benjamin Franklin, America's beloved inventor, takes an unexpected journey through time. But with his leap, he unleashes a powerful ripple. Now, with dark forces lurking in the shadows, harnessing this energy to shatter and enslave the world, it's a race against time. Will Franklin fix the future? Or will history rewrite itself? Uncover the secrets. A ripple through time, Franklin's Folly. Time has never been more fragile. On Amazon now.
Let's set the scene of the world Plato lived in. Ancient Greece, particularly Athens, was a hotbed of cultural, political, and intellectual revolution.
That's right. This was the era of the Peloponnesian War, a massive conflict between Athens and Sparta that reshaped Greek politics.
And it wasn't just wars. Athens was experiencing what we now call the Golden Age. Democracy was taking root, with leaders like Pericles at the helm.
A time of great thinkers too. Sophists were popular, traveling teachers who argued that truth was subjective.
And here's Plato, in the midst of all this, questioning the very foundations of knowledge and reality. He was living in a society grappling with ideas of democracy, justice, and individual rights.
Plus, let's not forget the religious and mythological aspects of Greek life. The gods were a big deal, and their stories intertwined with daily life and philosophy.
Exactly. And in this vibrant, often tumultuous setting, Plato's ideas about eternal forms and a world beyond the senses offered a stark contrast to the prevailing beliefs and political upheavals of his time.
It's fascinating how his philosophy was both a product of and a reaction to the times he lived in.
Definitely. The Athens Plato knew was rich in artistic expression, philosophical debate, and political experimentation. It was this unique crucible that shaped his thoughts and writings.
So, when we read Plato, we're not just reading the musings of a philosopher. We're getting a glimpse into one of the most dynamic periods of human history.
Absolutely. His work is a window into the soul of ancient Greece. Let's take a closer look at Plato's beginnings. He was born around 428 BCE, during a tumultuous period in Athens' history.
Right, and his family was quite illustrious, wasn't it?
Indeed. His father, Aristotle, claimed descent from the king of Athens, Codrus, and even the god Poseidon. Plato's mother, Pryxian, was related to the famous lawgiver Solon.
Talk about a pedigree. Born into nobility and possibly, if you believe the myths, part god.
His real name was actually Aristocles. Plato was a nickname, likely referring to his broad physical build. The name Plato means broad in Greek.
I guess nicknames were a bit more straightforward back then.
As a young man, Plato had ambitions for a career in politics, but the chaotic political climate of Athens at that time, especially the execution of Socrates, deeply influenced his path towards philosophy.
So, instead of following in the family tradition of politics, he took a sharp turn into philosophy.
Yes, and it wasn't just the political upheaval. His family was deeply involved in Athenian society. His uncles Charmides and Critias were prominent figures, although controversial for their association with the 30 Tyrants, the short-lived oligarchic regime.
So, he was surrounded by politics, philosophy, and drama from a young age.
Precisely. This blend of aristocratic lineage, political turmoil, and philosophical inquiry in his family circle laid the foundation for Plato's expansive view of the world.
It's like he was destined to become a philosopher with all that going on around him.
It certainly seems that way. His early life and family background provided a rich tapestry that deeply colored his philosophical pursuits and writings. Plato's achievements and associations are a testament to his profound impact on Western thought. Born into an era of intellectual ferment, his journey was marked by significant accomplishments and influential relationships.
That's right. His most pivotal association was with Socrates, whom he considered his mentor and guide. Plato was deeply influenced by Socrates' method of dialogue and his focus on ethical questions. After Socrates' tragic execution, Plato's works became a medium to preserve and continue his mentor's teachings. And then there's Aristotle, Plato's most famous student. Aristotle went on to become a philosopher of immense repute himself.
Exactly. The relationship between Plato and Aristotle laid the groundwork for some of the most significant philosophical discussions in history. While they agreed on many points, Aristotle would later diverge from Plato's ideas, particularly on the theory of forms.
Speaking of forms, that's one of Plato's key philosophical achievements, right?
Indeed. Plato's theory of forms postulated that the material world is just a shadow of a higher, more real world of ideas or forms. This idea was revolutionary and influenced centuries of philosophical thought.
And let's not forget the Academy.
Yes, the Academy. Founded around 387 BCE in Athens, it was one of the earliest institutions of higher learning in the Western world. It's fascinating to think that it operated for nearly 900 years after his death.
That's a long-lasting legacy. It became a center for philosophical, mathematical, and scientific research.
Plato also made considerable achievements in writing. His dialogues are masterpieces of philosophical literature, blending ethical, political, metaphysical, and epistemological inquiries with literary elegance.
His most famous work, The Republic, explores justice, order, and character in the individual and the city-state. It's where he outlines his vision of the philosopher king and the ideal state.
And we must mention his influence on political philosophy. Plato's thoughts on the ideal state, the role of the philosopher in society, and the nature of justice have shaped political theory through the ages.
It's incredible how his work has remained relevant, shaping philosophical discourse for over 2 millennia.
Absolutely, Chuck. Plato wasn't just a philosopher, he was a visionary whose ideas transcended his own time and continue to influence us today. Plato's beliefs and school of thought are as deep as they are influential. He developed a comprehensive philosophical system that still resonates today.
Yeah, and at the heart of his philosophy is the theory of forms, right?
Precisely. Plato proposed that the physical world isn't actually the world, instead, it's a shadow of a higher, unchanging reality. This reality consists of forms or ideas, which are perfect and eternal.
So, when we see a chair, it's just a poor copy of the form of a chair?
Exactly. The physical chair is transient and imperfect, whereas the form of a chair is eternal and perfect. This theory had profound implications for his understanding of knowledge and reality.
And then there's his famous allegory of the cave.
A cornerstone of Platonic thought. In this allegory, Plato describes prisoners chained in a cave, only able to see shadows projected on a wall, believing those shadows to be reality.
Until one of them escapes and sees the real world for the first time.
Right. This allegory illustrates Plato's belief in the world of forms and our struggle to perceive reality beyond our immediate senses.
And his views on ethics and morality were pretty groundbreaking too.
Indeed. For Plato, virtue and knowledge were closely linked. He believed that to know the good is to do the good. In his view, moral failure was a result of ignorance.
So, he saw philosophers, those who seek knowledge, as best suited to lead.
That brings us to his political philosophy, most famously outlined in The Republic. Plato envisioned an ideal state ruled by philosopher kings, as he believed they would rule with wisdom and justice, in contrast to the flawed democracies and oligarchies of his time.
But his ideas weren't just limited to the abstract. He was concerned with the education of the individual too.
True. Plato believed that education should be holistic, involving both the mind and the body, and aimed at the cultivation of virtue and wisdom.
It's incredible how broad his thinking was, covering everything from metaphysics and epistemology to ethics and politics.
Absolutely, Chuck. Plato's philosophy forms a foundational stone in the building of Western thought, providing a framework that countless philosophers have built upon over the centuries. Plato's role as a teacher and mentor shaped the course of Western philosophy. His impact extended far beyond his own writings, through the lives and minds of his students.
Right, and the most famous of them all was Aristotle, right?
Absolutely. Aristotle spent around 20 years at Plato's academy and is often considered Plato's most distinguished pupil. His own work laid the foundations for Western philosophy and science.
But Aristotle wasn't the only one, was he?
Not at all. Another notable student was Speusippus, Plato's nephew. He succeeded Plato as the head of the academy and contributed to the development of Platonic philosophy.
So, the academy was like a breeding ground for great thinkers.
Indeed, it was. The academy became a center for research and teaching in philosophy, mathematics, and the sciences. Students from all over the Greek world came to study there.
What about Plato's influence on his contemporaries and the generations that followed?
Plato's teachings had a profound impact on his contemporaries. His dialogues were widely read and discussed, influencing not just philosophers but also statesmen and educators.
And his influence didn't stop there, did it?
Far from it. Plato's ideas shaped the course of Neoplatonism, a major philosophical movement in the 3rd century AD. Thinkers like Plotinus were deeply influenced by Plato's ideas on the nature of reality and the role of the intellect.
It's fascinating how Plato's teaching not only impacted his immediate circle but also set in motion a wave of intellectual inquiry that spanned centuries.
Absolutely. The reverberations of his teachings can be felt throughout the history of Western thought. His academy, his dialogues, and his students together formed a legacy that has endured for over 2 millennia.
Plato wasn't just a philosopher, he was a teacher whose classroom extended far beyond the walls of the academy.
That's a perfect way to put it, Chuck. Plato's legacy as a teacher is as important as his philosophical writings, influencing countless minds and shaping the trajectory of philosophical inquiry throughout history.
Plato passed away at the ripe old age of 80.
That's pretty impressive for that time. He must have been doing something right.
Maybe it was all that philosophical thinking keeping his mind sharp.
Plato's lasting impact on Western thought cannot be overstated. His ideas have permeated various fields, influencing philosophy, politics, education, and even literature.
His theory of forms, for instance, is a cornerstone of Western metaphysics.
Right. It's this idea that there are perfect, unchanging forms beyond our sensory experience that influenced philosophical discussions about the nature of reality for centuries.
And his influence on ethics and political philosophy is monumental.
Absolutely. In The Republic, Plato explores the concept of justice, both in the individual and in the state. His vision of an ideal society governed by philosopher kings has been a reference point in political philosophy for ages.
Plus, his impact on education is massive. His holistic approach to education, emphasizing both the mind and body, has been a guiding principle in educational philosophy.
Then there's the academy, his lasting institutional legacy. It became a model for future centers of learning, setting a precedent for universities.
Speaking of the academy, it's fascinating how it became a hub for subsequent philosophical developments.
Indeed. It nurtured a lineage of thinkers who carried forward and expanded upon Platonic philosophy, influencing the development of Western intellectual history.
And let's not forget about his literary contributions. His dialogues are not just philosophical texts, they're literary masterpieces.
They blend deep philosophical insights with a narrative style that has inspired writers and thinkers throughout history.
And in modern times?
In modern times, Plato's influence can be seen in various fields. In psychology, for instance, Carl Jung's theory of archetypes echoes Plato's forms. And in the realm of political theory, his ideas continue to spark debate about governance and ethics.
So, we're still feeling Plato's influence, over 2,000 years later.
That's right, Chuck. Plato's legacy is enduring and all-encompassing. His philosophical inquiries laid the groundwork for much of Western thought, making him one of the most influential figures in the history of human thought. Well, folks, that's a wrap on Plato. A philosopher, a writer, a teacher, and an eternal thinker.
Thanks for tuning into the History AI podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through Plato's life and ideas, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share the podcast.
Stay curious and keep exploring the fascinating stories of history. Until next time.